Tonight, Eric Kaufmann of Birkbeck College. He's Professor of Politics at Birkbeck, recently a Belfer Fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and educated across the Old Witch at LSE.
Sorry for that.
He's written several books on political demography and the politics of ethnicity, nationalism, and conflict. Most recent which is Political Demography, Oxford publishers, which he was co-editor of, published in 2012. He's also written a book called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, which is more about the effect of birth rates and demography and population change on religious levels as compared to the more secular among us. His talk today is on ethnic fractionalization and interstate conflict, and well, nothing else to say. I have to let you get on with it.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks very much, and nice to be here. And so, the title, someone came up to me and talked to me about China. Now, China is in the title. It is part of the paper. The story about China, however, I'm going to have to leave till the end of the talk, and hopefully by the time we get to the end, it'll be clear why I've said what I've said about the title. So, I hope you're not expecting a lecture on China. However, it is relevant to that whole question of balance of power and shifts in the balance of power in the world. And this is very much a paper that I'm developing and which I'm hoping to turn into an article and a book. So I'd be very interested in hearing your response and your comments. So the paper is entitled Ethnic Fractionalization and Interstate Conflict. So that interstate conflict right away should flag up the fact that this is more of an international relations effect. So it's about relations between states, but yet ethnic fractionalization is a term that's almost exclusively been used by comparative politics people. And so I'm trying to kind of take something from comparative politics, transpose it into IR. Okay, what is ethnic fractionalization? I'll just begin, but let me just get out of the way here. So this is really just a map which I've created based on the share of the population of all countries made up by the largest ethnic group. And the darker the country, the greater the share of the population made up by the largest ethnic group. And you can see that almost all of Western Europe in here is between, 90 and 100% almost made up by the largest ethnic group. But other parts of the world are much less homogeneous, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a great deal of what's known as ethnic fractionalization, lots of different ethnic groups, each of which makes up a relatively small share of the population. Okay. So I'm not going to get into this, but other than to say what ethnic fractionalization measures is the likelihood that any two random individuals plucked out of a country are going to be members of the same ethnic group. So that's going to score, basically the fractionalization is going to be very high. 1 is the maximum level if you have a New Guinea situation with 1,000 languages, many different groups. It'll be 0 if you have a Japan situation where pretty much everybody's ethnically Japanese. So you also, however, between 0 and 1 have a number of different permutations. You can have a situation like Tanzania where that's a classic case of a very fractionalized country ethnically. Lots of small groups. But then you have Japan or Botswana, very homogeneous countries, where you'd have a very low index of close to 0. This would be close to 1. But then you have the in-betweens. Now, I put Northern Ireland and Sri Lanka here, two societies where you have two big groups. So Tamils and Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. You'll note that this may be the situation where, in fact, that is most conducive to ethnic conflict, civil war. In fact, some have made that claim. So that's just something to say about comparative politics and some of the studies of civil war that have used this concept of ethnic fractionalization. David Layton, James Fearon, well-known comparative political scientists, have come up with a similar concept, a different operationalization of ethnic fractionalization, but very similar to the map I showed earlier of share of the population made up of largest ethnic group. Most diverse part of the globe, again, is that sub-Saharan African belt. Most homogeneous parts of the world are either East Asia, that becomes relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today. Northeast Asia in particular, very ethnically homogeneous. Korea, Japan, China, Western Europe, and also North Africa, parts of the Western Arab Middle East. Here's something out of comparative politics. It's just a correlation between two, or a two-way graph between two particular indicators. One is the level of civil war, civil violence in the country, and the other is the share of the population made up of the largest ethnic group. So you can see where the share approaches Japan, 100%. At least on this graph, the level of civil violence is very low, whereas if you come out here, it's a big spread, and this is where the debate is, but there's a greater degree of this civil violence. And there's a big, very fractious debate, shall I say, within comparative politics as to how important this is. How important is it how ethnically divided and fractionalized a country is? So there's a big debate between those who say, well, the ethnic fractionalization index is not a predictor of civil war or ethnic war in a country, which is the position of these authors, Collier and Hoffler, David Layton, Stathis Kalivas, some of these names which you probably are familiar with. Instead, they say really what's going on is it's to do with poor countries, which also tend to be more ethnically fractionalized and have more civil war. So it's really a matter of income per capita, or it's to do with rough terrain, which allows rebels to hide in the countryside more easily, or newer states, which have a weaker hold on power, or the presence of oil resources, which leads to more violence. However, there are a number of authors who claim, actually, if you really look at the numbers, ethnic fractionalization is a predictor of civil war. I'm not going to get into this whole debate. Happy to answer questions on it. What I'm going to do, however, is to say, well, instead of looking at ethnic fractionalization and its effect on war within countries, so intra-state war, which is really what all this has been about, that is the risk of civil war, and of course, 95% of wars are civil wars, so naturally there's more of an interest in this, but is the risk of civil war going to be higher with an ethnically fractionalized society? What I'm going to now look at is, well, is an ethnically fractionalized society now going to be more likely to be involved in conflict outside its borders? So countries that are more fractionalized likely to be involved in more conflict. So here's the hypothesis then that I'm just playing with, and that is that ethnically fractionalized states initially are less likely to be involved in war. Why? Because they're probably more consumed with civil internal conflicts. However, once those conflicts are in some way pacified or consolidated, actually that internal diversity can become a force for a state that may propel that state to become more involved in interstate conflict. So it's a sort of non-linear, U-shaped, if you like, relationship, starting off with very low levels, a very low likelihood of a country being involved in war. Then as the fractionalization increases, the likelihood of being involved in war drops, and then it rises again. And I'll try and explain why I think this works, and then I'll try and show it through a number of cases and then some large N data as well. Part of this is because states which are ethnically divided, at least in the way I'm envisioning it, are looking for unifying ideologies which tend to be universalistic, expansionary, and would lead to power projection. So I've just listed a few of them here. It could be liberal democracy, it could be socialism, could be Islamism, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, and so on. These ideologies which are distinct ideologies. So if you've got a very ethnically fractionalized country, you may wish to build your nation on the basis of a creed rather than on the basis of ethnicity, because if you try and build it on the basis of ethnicity, it's going to be problematic because you've got many different ethnic groups in the country. Whereas external conflict can unify across lines of ethnicity. We talk quite a bit about the United States and the USSR as well. Some perspectives from the history and politics literature which I think bear on this subject. One is there's a literature on the relationship between ethnic nationalism and anti-imperialism that argues that ethnic nationalists are actually not very expansionist. So often in people's minds, people think of the Nazis, who were both ethnic nationalists and expansionists. But actually the Nazis are really quite an exception. In many cases you find such as in Russia or even in the United States. It's the people who see their nation as defined more by ancestry and ethnicity that are more reluctant sometimes to take new territories, partly because it's going to dilute the ethnic homogeneity of the country. And so the work of Beisner and Love is on the United States case during the Spanish-American War or the Mexican-American War, which I'll get to in a minute, and how some of the American nationalists were quite reluctant actually to annex territories which they felt were ethnically very different from Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. So that was sort of an important, or in Russia, the difference between, say, the Slavophiles who really thought, really we have to keep to a sort of Slavic-defined Russia versus the Eurasianists who were really looking more towards a kind of continental concept, imperial concept of Russia. Steve Seidemann, who gave a talk in this department, I believe, actually, and Ayers wrote quite an interesting book where they talked about the post-Soviet period and how certain countries such as Hungary, Romania and others, but particularly talking about the Hungarian case, why did Hungary not pursue irredentism in Transylvania, for example, after the fall of communism? So he was trying to answer this question, and part of the answer he gave was that actually Hungarian nationalists were not so keen on acquiring Transylvania because they would be acquiring a lot of Slovaks and Romanians and other non-Hungarian minorities. And that was an interesting perspective, an interesting check on that sort of imperialism, or what might be seen as imperialism. There's also literature on so-called missionary nationalism and its link to expansionism. So the concept of missionary nationalism is that your nation is the first among equals. So your nation is the missionary for a particular idea. It could be Islam, could be Catholicism, which was the case for France prior to the French Revolution, could be the American creed of liberal democracy. That this creed is what defines your nation. So it's an expansionist missionary nationalism. It's still nationalism. You can't say that Iran is not pursuing nationalism, even though it's defined by Islam and a version of Islamism. Yes, it's universalist, which is why it's expansionist, but on the other hand, it also defines Iran, because Iran is competing to be the number one carrier, number one missionary of the idea of Islam in the Muslim world. So that's another angle on this. And Prezel's work on national identity and foreign policy is also relevant here. Then there are a few articles that look at dominant minority groups, states like Syria or Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Certain countries a very small number of countries are ruled by what's known as a dominant minority, like the Alawis in Syria with Assad. So when you have a dominant minority, 11% of Syria's population, they can't just rule with the secret police. They have to try and get wider legitimacy. So part of the way they do that is through pan-Arabism as an ideology. So again, they're going to push more aggressively into foreign policy. They're going to start engaging in foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel, Lebanon, partly to bolster their legitimacy with the Sunni Arab population. I know it's shot now, but prior to the current crisis. There's also another literature on nationalist leaders who are of minority or mixed ancestry. People like Masaryk, Sheptynsky. Here we're talking about Central and Eastern Europe, the nationalists of the 19th, early 20th century. But even if you look at today, somebody like a Geert Wilders, or if you go back to the Spanish Inquisition and Torquemada, these are people who are descendants of minority groups that are not in the majority. So in the case of, Torquemada, he was descendant of actual Jews who'd converted to Catholicism, or Wilders with his sort of Asian heritage. Masaryk, again, Czech nationalist, but parentage is sort of mixed Slovak and German. There's quite a few nationalists who sort of fit that bill. And even someone like a Stalin, I think you can look at Stalin as a Georgian who led the USSR, which is a Russian-speaking entity, and you could make a similar case of this. So there's some interesting work on the biographies of nationalist leaders who have a kind of minority background. There's also work, if you look at the poster board, Anatole Lieven's America, Right or Wrong is there. Lieven's work, Lieven has done a lot of work on neoconservatism. And what's interesting about neoconservatism, and it fits this model quite well, is it's a version of conservatism that is open to people who are not sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That was part of its appeal, not all of its appeal, but part of its appeal. Similarly, I think with Iranian Islamism. So in both cases, you can be Jewish and Catholic and be a neocon, or you can be Japanese American, like Fukuyama, and be a neocon. Iranian Islamism, similarly, as I'll talk about Ahmadinejad in a minute, who's not Persian in his ancestry. So it's a way of it's a way for these movements to gain wider support and a way for minorities to prove their patriotic credentials. And then finally, there's a kind of literature in IR theory, the realist literature, and work here by Steve Van Evera of MIT, where he talks about how societies that have internal fractures, could be ethnicity, could be class. There's nothing like a war to unify a population. So that is another way in which we can look at why those internal divisions might prompt a state to be more involved in international disputes. Just going to walk briefly through the US case, which I think does illustrate this to some degree. If we go back to the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, or even if we go to the Spanish-American War, and here is a quote actually from an American Congressman, John Bell, from Tennessee in 1857. And there was a real debate between some, there were some Americans who really wanted to annex all of Mexico. And this was a debate after the Mexican-American War. So Sam Houston, whose name, this is where Houston, Texas gets his name from. But Sam Houston was an example of somebody who wanted to annex Mexico and go into South America, really actually take more land. But there were those who said, well, wait a minute here. And this is a quote, when you shall have extended your dominion over the states of Mexico and Central America, you'll have added 12 million of a population. Perfectly imbecile. Obviously the racism coming in here. But part of that, what's interesting about this comment is that they really didn't, there was a strand of American ethno-nationalists who really did not want to acquire Mexico. They are happy to acquire the bits that had a lot of land and very little people, but they didn't really want to acquire the parts of Mexico that were more heavily populated because they felt this would dilute the United States, which they felt more or less was a white Anglo-Protestant country. So here is a link then between ethnic nationalism and anti-imperialism. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the figures in this picture. Part of the point about neoconservatism that Lieven makes, and that I want to make, is that neoconservatism is an ideology of hardline, liberal, democratic, capitalist expansionism in a way. It's about regime change, it's about spreading liberalism, democracy, and capitalism. So it's not necessary that you be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant to buy into that ideology. And that's why you could say it's a quite inclusive conservative nationalist creed, if you like. And this is why, in a way, if you go back to this, before the Second World War in the United States, it was very hard to be considered 100% American if you were not Protestant and white. After the Second World War, this begins to change. And one barometer of this is Senator Joseph McCarthy. Over here, McCarthy, of course, well known for his witch hunt of members of the Communist, what he thought were members of the Communist Party in Hollywood, amongst the American intelligentsia and so forth. But what's interesting is McCarthy, as a Catholic, would have been seen as an outsider before the war, but now could pose as an ultra-American patriot, hardline anti-communist, and in fact could attack members of the WASP elite as being communist in a way. So that was an interesting change in American national identity. Move ahead maybe a decade to Barry Goldwater, part half Jewish, first presidential candidate who is Jewish. And what's interesting about Goldwater, again, like McCarthy, he earns his stripes by being a hardline anti-communist, the hardest of hardline anti-communists. He wants to bomb even more in Vietnam and so on. Why? Well, again, part of this is that you don't have to be Protestant to be a hardline anti-communist. It's actually relatively open to members of different ethnic groups. So there's that connection then, which I think is important as well. I talked about Fukuyama and neoconservatism, and I won't go into more detail on that. I've got Bobby Jindal there because he's sort of a potential future Republican presidential candidate. But again, showing where you can be hardline on a lot of things, including the whole liberal democratic capitalist agenda, as well as conservative religion, abortion, and things. You don't have to necessarily fit an ethnic type. And so it's a version of conservatism, version of ultranationalism that doesn't require ethnic homogeneity. Okay. So I've talked a bit about minorities, ethnically fractionalized societies, and strong versions of nationalism that are based on missionary ideologies, such as liberal democratic capitalism, which is the basis of neoconservatism. Now we can see, I think, this kind of dynamic in other societies. I'm just going to run through a few examples here. USSR, their ideology was expansionist socialism. I would call this a nationalism, by the way. I wouldn't call it anti-national. I'd call it a nationalism. It's just that it was a missionary nationalism on behalf of socialism. And it's also interesting that you had a number of figures, Stalin, Trotsky, Beria, Mikoyan, these who are Georgian, Armenian, whatever. They're not Russian by ethnicity, but yet they're ultra-uber Soviets. And not coincidentally, I think the USSR as a society relatively ethnically fractionalized, only 50% ethnic Russian. Here's another example, Iran, 45 to 50% ethnic Persian. Again, a relatively diverse, relatively fractionalized country. And my argument is that those relatively fractionalized countries will be more likely to seek recourse to these missionary ideologies to form the basis of their national identity. I think we can put Afghanistan and Pakistan in the same category, by the way. So much easier to unify your country on the basis of what 92% of the population share, which is Shia Islam. That's an easier thing to do than to base it on this, 45, 50%. Syria is another example. I'm going through a number of Muslim countries. I don't want to suggest that this is a phenomenon that is largely confined to the Muslim world. But Syria is another classic case where the ruling elite drawn from a population that makes up only 11% of the total country. So they're going to have to look wider than that to justify themselves and their hold on power. And this is part of the reason why they look to pan-Arabism, which can appeal to 87% of the population. Okay. Now, they could actually become an Islamist country like Iran if they so desire. There are various reasons why that's tricky. Partly because the Alawis are a sort of Shia sect, and the Sunnis are 60%, so that would be a tough one to push, whereas in Iran it's much easier when you've got 92% Shia. But Sub-Saharan Africa, again, you can have a situation, South Africa, 18% Hausa as the sort of leading group in the ANC. They now have to build a coalition, probably easier to base it on the 80% black African share of the population than on being a Hausa. So Pan-Africanism then is the logical, ideological basis for South African nationalism of the ANC. So in all these situations, I think we have that link between ethnic fractionalization, that is a low percent of the population that's made up, Sudan another example, a low percentage of the population made up of the dominant group, and therefore recourse to a universalist ideology which can unify a much larger body of the population behind these nationalisms. And then finally, perhaps leaders who come from minority groups. Not always, but I showed a few in the US case with neoconservatism. Now, how much time have I got left? Let's see, we've got, well,
a set time.
Okay.
About 40 minutes.
Good, okay. What I'm going to do now is, people might say, well, look, you've plucked some of the easy cases that justify your theory, and what about the Nazis? What about cases where clearly ethnic nationalism and imperialism go together very well? So what I've done now is to sort of take this to generalize this to a larger sample, which is all the world's countries since the Second World War, basically. To take a sort of large and what they call a large N data set of all countries, and to see whether there's a link between the more ethnically diverse or fractionalized countries and the propensity to be involved in an interstate conflict. Those of you who are IR students might be familiar with some of this research, which is largely a US-based quantitative IR research. What I'm trying to do is bridge that qualitative case study method with the more quantitative. The quantitative method then looks at something called the dyad, which is a strange word if you haven't come across it before. All a dyad is two countries in a given year. So France and Malawi, 1991, that's sort of one dyad. You can imagine 200 countries in the world times 200 countries times all the years since the Second World War, and you've got a lot of cases. So for example, one data set based on these dyads is called the Militarized Interstate Disputes, MID, which is probably the most popular one. There were only 1,748 events recorded out of actually a potential of hundreds of thousands. But in this case, a slimmed down data set of 30,000. It's still kind of needle in the haystack. So most countries at most times are not engaged in a conflict. In very few cases are they engaged in a conflict. So partly because there are so few conflicts across state boundaries, we then have a sort of looser data set which sort of takes a broader definition of dispute. It can involve like a fish war, or something that's a little less stringent can be counted as an event in this data set. So these are the two data sets that I'm going to be looking at. This second one counts nonviolent crises and latent crises as wars. So even, for example, the US and Cuba since 1962, clearly not a war, but would be considered to be a dispute in every year since 1962 in this Kaufmann data set. Just as an example of what this sort of data set would look like, here is one dyad, Albania, Serbia. Oops, something happened there. This is so for the year 1992, that would be one dyad. Each of these would be a dyad. And you can see some, in this Kosovo, the looser dyad data set includes some quite strange cases like Canada and France over the Quebec issue. So there are it is a very loose definition of conflict. But still, interesting to look at. So the way that I've tried to get at this question of whether ethnically fractionalized states are more likely to be involved in conflict is to say, well, as I mentioned earlier, the ethnically fractionalized states initially, when the state is founded, are too busy fighting each other or disputing with each other to actually get the state to be involved in a conflict with other states. So initially, that's not going to matter. But as a state matures, so the older the country, if a country is fractionalized and old, that's when it's more likely to be involved in a conflict. So that's the theory. It's not just fractionalization, but it's a combination of fractionalization plus old. And that's measured by this state founding date. So the older countries, which are in the yellow here, which is the Americas mostly, Europe, Asia. And the newer countries, mainly Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia. Ex-colonies, by and large. Okay, this did not come out, unfortunately. Ooh. Oh yes, that did come out. Okay. So this is kind of the way the statistical analysis would show up. Now, what I've done is I don't know if you've ever looked at statistical output, but it's pretty ugly. So what I've tried to do is actually graph it, even though true quant people would kill me for this, but actually it's much easier to understand when you have it like this. So what this is a measure of how strong each of these predictors are in predicting interstate conflict. And so, for example, the biggest predictor of whether two countries are going to go to war is how far away they are from each other, the distance here. And hang on. Yeah. So anyway, this doesn't work very well. The distance, and I've got a negative there, all that means is it's actually the closer you are together. So the smaller the distance, the more likely you are to be involved in a conflict. If you share a border with another country, you're much more likely to be involved in the conflict. So the basic stuff which you have to put in there to control for. But what I'm interested in is this one here, this ethnic fractionalization. which shows a negative. So actually what that shows is countries that are more ethnically diverse are actually less likely to be involved in an interstate conflict in the period. This is a sort of expanded version of the same analysis. And I just want you to focus on the arrows and try and screen all this other stuff out for a second. What these arrows are showing are the ethnic fractionalization of state 1 in the dyad. So if we're talking about, I don't know, Iran and the US, you'd have the fractionalization of Iran here as state 1, and that shows negative. So that is, the more fractionalized the country is, less likely it is to go to war. So that's, again, refuting the thesis that I'm putting forward. However, if you then multiply the fractionalization by how old the state is, it's the reverse. It's a positive effect, and quite strongly, in both states. So that's to suggest, again, this U-shaped relationship. So initially, very fractionalized states, unlikely to go to war, but then as you get the state that is more established and older, so multiplying fractionalization by age, then more likely to go to war. So significantly more likely to be involved in a war if you have an old state that's, or an established state that's fractionalized. The other interesting thing is major power. So one of the members of the UN Security Council, Britain, France, US, China, Russia, only 5 of them. The more multiply by that country's ethnic fractionalization. So the US or the USSR would probably be the most fractionalized, and then sort of China, France, and Britain the least. That isn't significant. This is the sort of significance line. So it's below that. Even though it's approaching it, it hasn't yet reached it in this MID data set. But in the wider Kosovo data set, in fact, that predictor, again, this is so scrunched up, but it's the same. So it has exceeded the significance line. So it does seem to be a factor, along with very similar relationships, and that'll become clearer as we look at this chart here. Don't worry, I will get to China in a minute. So what I found is across both data sets, very different, a very similar relationship, and that is, on the face of it, ethnic fractionalization causes a reduction in the likelihood of a country to go to war with another country, or to be involved in a dispute with another country, and that can be as much as joining a coalition that's involved with Iraq or with Syria. So being part of a coalition means you are technically in dispute with Syria, even if you're not actually putting guns on the ground. But still, that the more fractionalized countries, less likely to be involved in those disputes. However, the older fractionalized countries, dramatically more so in both cases. So that would support the argument that I've been making about societies that, once you get past the initial growing pains of perhaps an ethnic civil war or perhaps ethnic tensions within the country, once you get past that and the state becomes established, actually those tensions then can lead the society, I think, to involve itself in a more missionary type nationalism based on a unifying ideology, which then leads it to project itself outwards into the international arena. And the major powers that are more fractionalized do, in some of these models, do seem to be. It hasn't quite reached significance there, but in there, this one it definitely is significant. So USSR, USA, more likely, obviously, to be involved in conflicts than China and France. So, conclusion, I will talk about China in a minute, but so conclusion, ethnically fractionalized states, initially too consumed with civil war to be involved in interstate conflict. However, once consolidated, those forces then lead it to search for these unifying ideologies, such as socialism, pan-Islamism, liberal democratic capitalism, and so on, which embroil it in more international disputes. Partly, this external conflict helps to unify the country behind a common project, such as in the case of Iran and Shia Islam, and the fact that a Turkmen such as Ahmadinejad can be an ultra-Iranian patriot. He doesn't have to be Persian to be a nationalist. Okay, so the big question then, which you've all been waiting for, how does this affect the rising powers, the BRICS, if you like? How are they affected by what I've had to say? And I think one thing we can do is look at the ethnic composition of a number of these rising powers. So China. One thing that's remarkable about China is that it's 92% Han Chinese, despite regional and dialect differences, ethnically quite homogeneous. India. Now, the difficult thing with India is it's very linguistically diverse, like China. But you can make the argument that at least at a pan-ethnic level, roughly 85% of the population is Hindu, thereabouts. So again, if you want to take that view, reasonably homogeneous country. Russia, compared to the old Soviet Union, a much more homogeneous society than the old Soviet Union. Brazil, again, despite racial differences between sort of people with slightly darker or lighter skin, that's not an ethnic difference. That's just a skin color difference, which doesn't actually have ethnic meaning. So in a way, also, from the point of view of ethnicity and culture, Brazil is not particularly diverse. It's overwhelmingly Portuguese-speaking, relatively homogeneous. Again, the only country of the rising powers that you might say might be a candidate for this sort of ethnic fractionalization, interstate conflict dynamic is Indonesia, because the Javanese are only 40% of the population. So you might say, okay, in Indonesia we have 40% Muslim. What would the regime or what would the dominant group look to as a unifying missionary ideology? Well, it would be Islam. Now, the one thing I want to say is this theory is only a piece of the puzzle. It's not explaining even the majority of why states go to war. So in the case of Indonesia, that is an option, but we also know that Indonesia is on the periphery of the Muslim world. Its brand of Islam is not particularly conservative. So it's not probably going to be a leading candidate for spearheading an Islamic revolution or an expansionary Islamism in the world. But what is interesting, however, is if you take the other BRIC countries, all, at least in my view, relatively ethnically homogeneous, which means that the national identities are based more on the dominant ethnic group. And therefore, those national identities would be less expansionist. They don't need to expand so much in order to find themselves in the world. They can just be, if you like, because their national identity rests more on their internal cultural homogeneity than it does on an external ideological project. So, something to think about.
All right. So, needless to say, thank you, Professor, for speaking tonight. We do have some time for questions, and we also have the wine and other things at the back if you want to have that. And so, if you have any questions, we have a couple ourselves, but obviously open the floor to any of you first.
Right. In fact, I have been having a very healthy discussion with Jonathan for a year over what it means to be a Han. 92, well, actually 93%, because we have a population increase. According to the latest, it's 93 now. Well, if you are a modernist, then probably you have good arguments to argue for that figure, because yes, you can classify 93% of them as one single homogeneous national identity. But if you are pre-modernist, well, it is a very, very, very tricky question, because within that category you have a massive, massive regional difference. And in fact, it took the Communist Party 7 years, actually 7.5 years, to settle that score, because the pre-modernists, predominantly led by some scholars from Peking University, conducted a massive survey in China to find out how many nationalities we had. And some of them were heavily influenced by the Soviets, so they went around the country and found out there were 460 something different nationalities. And later, it was quite a bloody process. It involved a lot of negotiations, a lot of internal conflicts, and even assassinations. So some of the leaders were assassinated for demanding greater autonomy, greater recognition, perhaps more specific recognition within the group. And but in the end, it just came down to 56, and made it easier for them to govern. And but what I'm talking about now is I have traveled around China into all 31 provinces. I have witnessed the diversity myself, and obviously analyzed all these diversities with relevant Western theories. And I found out 400 was not enough. You need 800. Depends on where you look at, whether you're colonialist or whether you are modernist. So that is a very, very arguable number. So I probably would doubt about that 92% or 90%. And given that is an ongoing process, because now we have massive regionalization taking place in China, so a lot of the oppressed Han Chinese realize their, their ethnic identities, so they started manufacturing their ethnic identities abroad. So you have all the London buses with the Hangzhou thing. I think, yeah, they are quite unique in terms of their ethnicity, but at the moment they are classified as Han. So they are trying to project their ethnic identity abroad to get better, greater recognition. So perhaps one day they will get a fair share, perhaps become another new ethnicity. So we have this evolving dynamic taking place.
Which groups would you have in mind?
It's the Hakka.
Oh, the Hakka, okay.
Yeah.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, you know more about this than I do. I mean, the only thing I would say is, when I talk about ethnicity, it's a community that believes itself to be descended from the same ancestors. It's not necessarily defined by culture. So even though you have different linguistic groups, even different, perhaps, religions, even though that's less prevalent, but that wouldn't on its own necessarily be enough to denote a different ethnic group. So, but I take your point that in a way there are lots of cultural diversities, but whether it can develop into a full-blown ethnic movement, it is possible to do. It's been known that these movements suddenly are manufactured and emerge after being asleep for many years. But it's also the case that China, if you look at Chinese history and the memory that's been developed over time of those Chinese empires that rose up and collapsed and rose up and collapsed, but still, it is actually ethnically more homogeneous. I think I would make that argument than other parts of the world. And so, even though I acknowledge the linguistic diversity, I'm not sure whether it means that there are going to be new ethnic groups that pop up with demands and territorial demands and things like that.
Well, obviously
maybe
the central government has managed to dilute, perhaps break down some of the potential ethnic groups, and obviously migration has a major effect demographically, so to break up some of the potential ethnic groups that might actually congregate and make some demands. So it's an evolving process.
If I'm not mistaken, the metric that you used was number of conflicts, not necessarily the scale of conflicts?
Yes, that's right. Yes, exactly. So if in a given year 2 countries are at war, they get like a 1. If they're not at war, they get a 0. Or not war. It could be any kind of dispute. So that's the metric that's used. So it doesn't say anything about the intensity. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the comment about, or the sort of implication about China or any of these other countries being homogenous and peaceful, they could engage in a single nuclear war, for example, and they'd be considered peaceful. I'd just be a little bit careful with the labeling.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's still of interest to say, for example, that a country's less likely to be involved in a dispute. Of course, whether the intensity of that dispute it's outside the model in a way. I mean, it could be that nuclear war. You're absolutely right. Let's hope not.
Yes.
I was wondering, have you looked at any of the Central Asian countries specifically? So, for instance, after the Soviet period. So, if I haven't misunderstood, Kazakhstan, for example, fit your model. Sorry.
Yeah, Kazakhstan, because of the Russian minority, you mean, and other minorities.
Yeah, or almost a majority at some point as well. Earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I want to suggest this is sort of one factor that should be factored into a whole explanation. It's not a trump card, but Kazakhstan. So yeah, you would have a Kazakh group. Now, you have different configurations. So it might be in Kazakhstan that the Kazakhs really think, Kazakhstan is ours, and to hell with everybody else, so we're not going to bother developing an ideology that can include the Russians, because we're going to try and get them to leave, or hopefully they'll leave. So that is a different approach. That's kind of been the approach in Estonia with the Russians as well. So it's not inevitably the case that these dominant ethnic groups that are slender majorities are going to opt for an inclusive universalistic nationalism. They might opt for a quite sort of internally repressive ethnic nationalism. So Kazakhs might just say, well, to hell with the Russians, they're not real Kazakhs, so we're going to have an ethnic nationalism. And in that case, then no, this wouldn't apply, because they wouldn't have any need to appeal to a wider ideology to underpin their nationalism, because they have no legitimacy problems, since their legitimacy is only based on that. Perhaps, so in this case, no, I don't think it does fit the model. No.
Okay, Carlos, and then Richard.
I was going to ask a similar question. To what extent is this model kind of applicable? Because at least in the case of, for instance, Latin America, you mentioned in Brazil as being pretty much homogeneous. I would totally concur in that sense. Mainly because a lot of the issues they have within Brazil, and just within the cities, for instance, in the case of Rio, it's kind of ethnically, historically related in the fact that the poor population, which is African mainly, live in a part of the city which is dangerous, and there's a lot of things going on, and the other part, which is white, lives in the other part of the city. If it's peaceful, it's not because of ethnic homogeneity, it's peaceful because of political compromises that have been kind of established within the state, such as the case of Mexico, I would argue as well, both in the case of Latin America. And then I would say, well, then if they are not that homogeneous, how are they managing to be successful or peaceful? I would just go to the political argument rather than using ethnicity. Because when I think about ethnicity, then I also think about West Africa, for instance, in which it has been mainly considered as an ethnic issue, but it's rather a problem of representation. With, for instance, in the case of Liberia, having a political elite, not really ethnically different to the other ones, and that's a problem of politics. So my question would be, to what extent is this model applicable to all these cases which you have argued, or it would be to specific cases of, for instance, major countries that disintegrated, for the case of Russia, for instance, or, well, my colleague here just remarked the concept, the situation within China, or for instance, kind of China, India, how would it work?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be applicable to some countries more than others. On average, it's going to have some effect, but that averaging conceals that in many countries it'll have no effect, and in some countries it'll have a big effect. So the average of that is it has some effect. Now, so what you say about Brazil, I mean, I do take your point that if particularly the black population becomes politicized, as it looks like they are maybe starting to become more politicized, and starts to think of themselves as a different group, then that could start to lead to more, their fractionalization could go up. If those black Brazilians see themselves as, well, if I do well at university, I become more kind of white, if you like, in inverted commas. If it's a sliding thing where there's upward mobility and it's vaguely defined, so if it's a continuum of skin color and class and these things, because they've done studies that suggest that actually if you become white collar and you're wearing a suit and tie, then you're perceived as being a bit more white. So it's not purely, whereas if you are a Protestant in Northern Ireland, you can put a suit on it, or if you're, let's say, in the old days, if you're Catholic in Northern Ireland, you've got middle class Catholics, working class Catholics, you're still a Catholic. There's no mobility. Those are very hard and fast categories. So I think it's a tricky one in ethnic terms to say Brazil is ethnically fractionalized. I think it's a tricky statement because there are color differences, there's class differences. There is a correlation at the bottom between those two, but whether you would call it ethnic or not, that is a group that thinks of itself as being, we are, like the African Americans very much are an ethnic group because they see themselves as descendants of slaves, marked out by skin color. But it's just that in Brazil it's not as clear cut as that, I would say.
The issue with that is that precisely in law enforcement and crime containing policies, it is being addressed as that. Because actually the difference is clearly related to color and ethnicity. And that's the whole policy, the security policy within Rio, which is what I've been doing during the last years, is related to ethnic targeting. Because those groups have been actually proved to be historically forgotten by the government public policy. And
But you're saying it's the white police who are targeting blacks?
No. It is not the police, the government itself.
Government.
If you see the composition of, for instance, the Brazilian parliament, it's mainly white.
Yes.
The Rio de Janeiro prefecture was similar, and there is a problem with representation in terms of.
Oh, I agree with you, but the question that I would have, I mean, I noticed this, I've been to Brazil once, and I did notice this in Sao Paulo, but it's one thing to say that people who wind up in jail are dark-skinned and poor, and that they're discriminated against. But it very much matters what those dark-skinned poor people are thinking and writing, and how they imagine themselves, and how they're politically organizing themselves. For example, do they have a party that calls it, for them? Do they have a social movement? I think it's starting, but it hasn't historically been there like it's been in the United States, where you've got the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, you've got the African American Caucus, you've got very clear ethnic boundary lines. I think it's been a bit messier in Brazil, where you've got color differences, but they haven't been activated and politicized in this idea of a group with clear boundaries, with a myth of origin going back to slavery, etc. It's just been less delineated. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I just don't know whether it's ethnic fractionalization or whether it's just a racial thing. But yeah. But I mean, I take your point. I'm not saying this is the whole story. I mean, Liberia, an interesting case where you had the American Liberians who were the dominant group, basically. Now, you can say that it's just about inequality and politics. However, the fact that it's organized on ethnic lines, the fact you have an ethnic group, Americo-Liberians, who are so obviously more advantaged than the rest, is an important thing. The fact you have group inequalities, that one group is on average better off, perhaps better educated than another group, is not an insignificant thing. So it's not just individuals who are unequal, it's also groups that are unequal. I guess that would be my point. I wouldn't say it's all about ethnicity at all, but it's an interaction between ethnicity and politics.
Well, I think you mentioned it already, but would you say that your model is probably applicable only to the post-war world, where it's probably more globalized, as opposed to, I don't know, the 18th and 19th century, whereby, homogeneous countries like Japan still embarked on colonial expansionism, and also when Europe was still very much homogeneous in this kind of ethnic thing, it still had, explicitly colonial policies in terms of its foreign policy. So would you say that's probably more of a recent phenomenon to engage in, interstate conflict for reasons of ethnicity?
Right. That's a very interesting question, and I admit I haven't given as much thought to that past. But I guess if you look to the big empires, the Ottomans, the Russians, and also the overseas empires, the French and the British, I guess there was a kind of separation, I guess, between the home metropole, which was actually ethnically homogeneous, and the colonies. And really, when it really came to the crunch, colonial subjects were not really admitted or included in the same way as subjects at home were. So I would make the argument that those were not ethnically fractionalized nations. They were kind of nations which had colonies abroad. But I take your point that in a way, whether your nation was homogeneous or not didn't really affect its likelihood of acquiring overseas colonies. I guess they were able to balance, to make it work, because they were able to keep a boundary, I suppose, between their colonies and the homeland. If that had started to muddy, that would have been a very good test of the thesis. It is true that a lot of empires that were very kind of mixed, like the Ottoman Empire, were quite expansionist. So the Habsburg Empire, again, another example. In Russia, where you had the competition between the sort of more Slavophile group that wanted it to be consolidated more amongst Slavic Russians, and then you had the more expansionist-minded people who really thought in more imperial terms. So there you could perhaps you could see what I'm talking about going on there. That is, the ones who wanted ethnic homogeneity probably wanted to have tighter boundaries and less incorporation. The ones who were okay with a looser, non-ethnic type of identity were more in favor of a sort of more expansionist project. I think with Turkey, when you look at Turkey, the shift from the Ottoman Empire to Kemalism is a shift from a more, if you like, universalistic Islam type identity to a more ethnic Turkish. So in a way, collapse of empire brings about ethnic nationalism, whereas empire was associated with a more universalistic.
Yeah.
So that, I think, Ottoman Empire probably fits it quite well. Some of these others, a little less so.
Peter?
Yeah. My question is over your use of the term ethnicity. Who exactly determines what the ethnic groups are? And my question is also, if a group feels that they're of a different ethnicity, does that make them in actuality a different ethnicity? I think your methodology would be perhaps better sort of looking at it from a cultural identity perspective. And I don't know if there's anything that's like this that has...
When you say cultural identity, you mean...
Just self-identification of
Yeah.
some sort of
Well,
metric.
I should say that the ethnic fractionalization index measure I've taken from Fearon and Leighton, or
Okay.
from other people. So I have kind of taken a canned measure and used that rather than making up my own, which is where this stuff is derived from. But the thing about ethnicity is it's not observable for an external observer. You can't go around with a pencil and paper and say, there's the Chinese, there's the Kazakhs, etc. You can try and do that, but what you can observe are cultural symbols and cultural signs. But the thing about ethnicity is it is a subjective belief in shared ancestry that unites the group. So you can have a group that actually speaks different languages or changes its language, like the Jews are a good example of a group where you had Yiddish spoken, you had Arabic spoken, and now they're kind of also in Israel speaking Hebrew. So you had linguistic diversity there. Or the Han, you have Cantonese and Mandarin and other languages spoken. So it's not language, and it's also not necessarily religion. You've got Protestant Hungarians and Catholic Hungarians, or Estonians, whatever. So it's not, and it's also not skin color. Again, you've got black Jews and white Jews. So the point is not so much the culture, but it's the belief in being descended from Abraham and the 12 tribes and all this. So that is what actually unites it, regardless of the language. Now, you've got to have some cultural marker as well. So obviously, you don't have Muslim Jews, but so clearly there has got to be one cultural marker, but it only has to be one.
So it being a construct and largely defined by self-identification, do you think that 92% of Chinese would consider themselves Han, one? Two, do you think 95% of Brazilians would consider themselves Portuguese before white or black, for example?
The Han, I think so. I mean, this is an interesting one, but even Cantonese or Mandarin would, I believe, see themselves, if they think about their ancestry and their history, would be tracking back to the civilization, back to the Han. I mean, I think that's where their descent would be. I mean, you might have a different opinion, but in a way, this is where the core of it lies. It's collective memory, ancestry, and regardless of the language. So I would say yes. Now, in the case of Brazil, it's a very interesting question because some of the New World societies, I mean, I'm Canadian and you might be American if I'm picking it up correctly, but basically, the ethnic situation is fluid in some cases. So, in Canada and the US, the dominant ethnic group used to be Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and it's now just white, even if you're Catholic or Jewish, you're part of that. So these things can change over time, that's one thing. But in Brazil, that's a difficult one. I mean, because there hasn't been a real sort of black ethnic consciousness and party and movement in the way there has been in the United States. It's been that bit more fluid, I would argue. So, but where is it going? I don't know. I mean, it could go towards the American situation. But I think Mexico is an interesting case because there you did have this mixture and the mestizo becoming kind of the, an ethnic group and a majority ethnic. 1890s, 1917, that period, you had that kind of formation of a. Now, even though there are still a few blacks and there's still some Indians, but we.
We'll leave it there in terms of the questions, just because our hour's up. But we will be here afterwards, so if you have anything else to ask, Eric will also be here. We have been recording this, and it will be on our website and YouTube. There's no other announcements because it's the end of term. So the only other thing is to thank Professor Kaufmann again for coming, and hope you have a nice evening.